Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is our second event of the day, so I'm glad you made it here. This is Left Bank Books welcomes activist and writer Natalie Walton, who will discuss her new book, Revenge of the Sluts. Walton will be in conversation with health and sex education expert Shafia Zaloom. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Natalie and Shafia, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We do hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It also allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. We need your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience, from you, at the end of the event. So please type your questions as a comment. And be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have really just so many incredible events already lined up for the year and are adding events daily. We have fantastic events this week that I highly recommend checking out. About Revenge of the Sluts. Double standards are about to get singled out. In this stunning debut, author Natalie Walton tackles privacy and relationships in the digital age. As lead reporter for the Warrior Weekly, Eden has covered her fair share of stories at St. Joseph's Secondary. And when intimate pictures of 6 female students are anonymously emailed to the entire school, Eden is determined to get to the bottom of it. In tracking down leads, Eden is shocked to discover not everyone agrees the students are victims. Some people feel the girls brought it on themselves. Even worse, the school's administration seems more concerned about protecting its reputation than its students. With the anonymous sender threatening more emails, Eden finds an unlikely ally, the 6 young women themselves. Banding together to find the perpetrator, the tables are about to be turned. The Slut Squad is firing back. About today's speakers. Natalie Walton is the author of Revenge of the Sluts and the host of the podcast Sex Ed Taught Me. She wrote Revenge of the Sluts while working toward her BA in sociology and criminal justice. In college, she worked as a reporter, volunteered on a sexual violence support hotline, and wrote a thesis on sexual harassment mythology. She is the 2019 Harry S. Truman Scholar for Delaware, and she currently lives in Delaware, where she has lived for most of her life. And today, Natalie will be in conversation with Shafia Zaloom. Shafia is a health educator, parent, consultant, and author whose work centers on human development, community building, ethics, and social justice. Shafia has worked with thousands of children and their families in her role as teacher, coach, administrator, board member, and outdoor educator. She has contributed articles to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and numerous parenting blogs. Shafia's book, Sex, Teens, and Everything in Between, has been reviewed as the ultimate relationship guide for teens of all orientations and identities. Shafia is currently the health teacher at the Urban School in San Francisco and develops curricula and trainings for schools across the country. She was honored by the San Francisco Giants Foundation in 2018 for her work with Aim High, a program that expands opportunities for students from low-income neighborhoods and their teachers through tuition-free summer learning enrichment. Her work has been featured by many media outlets, including the New York Times, USA Today, NPR, KQED, and PBS. And without further ado, I would like to say that because Natalie's book has been so incredibly popular, we sold out, but we have more that are, I believe, being received today. So you can go ahead and order the book online on our website, left-bank.com. The books are minutes away from being received and being on our shelves. So you will get a copy that is literally so fresh off the press that it probably still like has that great book smell. And we do also have Shafia's book available for sale as well. Without further ado, now I would love to welcome Natalie and Shafia for Left Bank Books. Hello.
Hi. Thank you for
Hi.
joining us.
Absolutely. It is our pleasure.
So I thought we would just start with a little conversation. Natalie, something that I noticed. So Natalie and I have been doing this for a while, and we're actually having a lot of fun doing it and learning a lot from each other, certainly, I think. And one of the things that I love to open with is just asking Natalie about what it feels like to be a young author, to have a book published, to be able to hold it in your hands. I had read the acknowledgments that you've been dreaming of this since you were 7 years old. And so just want to hear a little bit about what that's actually like for you.
Yeah, it's so unbelievably exciting. I mean, it's one of those where it's you start off at like a young age and you keep working toward it and keep working toward it. And I think there's almost that feeling of like, okay, now that we've done the first one, like what's next? But I think it's inspiring more than like, like a pressure. It's like, okay, I did the first one. I can totally do this again. Like I can absolutely I'm going to keep writing. I'm going to keep, doing these things. So I think it's just been really wonderful for me and just like, I still sometimes can't believe it's real. I mean, it's more now a month past publication. I've had, my book deal for, I don't know how, it feels like the publication process takes forever. So I've known about it and I've been thinking about it and been waiting on it. Now that it's actually here, I'm still just kind of like, oh yeah, like I have a physical book. Like this is like my name and my work. So.
Oh, that's awesome. I am so grateful for your book because as a teacher who talks about this stuff all the time and as someone who does parent education and workshops, I love it when there's something really concrete that we can use as a resource by which to have these really important conversations. So your book is about it's basically about revenge porn. So the non-consensual sharing of nude photographs. And this is a topic that not a lot of young audiences have the benefit of hearing about, despite the fact that it's a part of everyday life for many of them. What inspired you to actually write about this topic in particular? And can you talk a little bit about how you thought it conjured up sort of the cast of characters? Because there are so many that so authentically represent the identities in the landscape of sort of teen world. So if you could talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the book kind of went through a whole bunch of kind of variations before I finally landed on this like kind of final version that included like elements of journalism and talking about masculinity and things like that in a little bit more detail. I mean, the seeds of it were planted when I was in I was maybe 12 or 13, and I started to become a little bit more aware of these like concepts of like slut shaming and how we would talk about people and kind of this awareness that like things might be a little bit different for me than it is for like my brothers growing up and that kind of idea. So I think that was really, it started pretty young and I was like, okay, this is interesting. I don't think I have the vocabulary to do this yet. So I'm going to put that on the back burner and see what happens. And then just kind of growing up, it became really clear kind of what issues were showing up and how gender was influencing kind of daily life and how sexuality comes into play and things like that. So I really wanted to be able to write about it. And exactly what you were saying before, there really aren't resources to talk about things like revenge porn. So when I was growing up, there weren't resources. And I still, to this day, I'm not really sure what's out there that is immediately accessible, where it's something where if you walked into, a health room or like a health class or something like that, you'd be able to actually learn about it and in a genuinely approachable, understandable, non-judgmental way. So I think that was the biggest thing, was kind of growing up and watching, revenge porn being eaten in that situation and kind of being like, what are we supposed to do? Like none of the adults are telling us what we're supposed to do. So I guess we're supposed to just like ignore it and it'll get better. Like I don't know. So it was really confusing and really hard. And if I can do anything, it's making sure people don't go through that.
And so the characters that you conjured up were really, in some ways, I mean, I feel like most teenagers who read this book, in fact, every teenager who reads this book will be able to find, it'll resonate in some way with them, people they know, things that they're witness to, and how it brings up this really relevant topic in a real way. And so, in terms of this subject in particular, you said that it's something that was sort of around you that you didn't really have a lot of information and resources about. Did you structure the book in a way, or were you thinking about how to also communicate information to young people who would be reading it and provide some guidance for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you were talking about earlier with the cast and kind of the goal with having such a large cast, part of that is setting the scene of what high school feels like, which is everyone's constantly kind of like on top of each other and constantly overlapping. And there's really no, like, at least my high school experience was that there really weren't hard social lines. There were all sorts of weird kind of like overlap and things that would people who were friends and people who weren't friends but would know each other and things like that. And it just feels very insular in a weird way. And I wanted to kind of capture that feeling of constantly being surrounded by people and constantly worrying about people who are around you. And then it's also being able to tap into that idea that people are different. Like there's not going to be one type of person who responds to an incident in the same way. And it's just, I think it's really important to kind of demonstrate that and show how people can still kind of learn and grow, and how just different situations might impact people differently, and how all of those experiences are, valid in one way or another. It's just a matter of, where you can go from there. And if there's anything else you need to work on, any skills, that kind of idea. I mean, even Eden demonstrates kind of a desire to learn and be a better ally throughout the book, and that kind of idea. So it's, it's a process of learning and being better and that kind of idea.
Well, and I love that we actually see so much of it through Eden's eyes, and that through her investigation, we learn what she does in trying to understand what the laws are, what the repercussions are, what the internal, emotional, embodied experiences of the survivors are, and then her relationship with her fellow journalists who are also interested in this, and the politics that sort of surround things like this in schools. And then her relationship, her love interest to a certain extent, Atticus, right? Like, who in many ways is this incredible ally. And the complexities that these relationships reveal that teenagers wrestle with all the time when it comes to their loyalties, their interests, what's going on. They have this power that none of us do, which is, knowing what's going down when the adults aren't around. And so the book really provides some incredible insight into all of that, which I think is so valuable. I also really appreciated how through Eden's journey of trying to understand this better, her learning about self-care, her learning through her conversations or interviews, so to speak, people who specialize in supporting survivors. I thought that was incredibly creative, for sure. So for adults, what were you hoping adults might, first and foremost, I think at least I got that this was really a book for a young audience, as it should be, right? But I can imagine, and I know just through our conversations, you really wanted adults to take some things away from this too. Could you articulate that a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the hard things about growing up was that nobody really wanted to have those conversations with me. And I think that's something that a lot of people go through, is that feeling of like, I have all of these questions, but I don't feel like I have somebody I can actually go to. So then you're like Googling stuff, or you're kind of just like sitting with it, and you're like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know what this is. And I don't know how to talk about it. And I don't know who to ask. So I'm just like not going to deal with it. And I just think that's such a disservice. And I think it's, the conversations are hard. Like, it's not something where I'm going to be like, oh, just talk to your kid about sex. Like, it's fine. Like, I understand that it's very, very difficult. And that's why I'm hoping to maybe offer something where it's a conversation starter for both young people and for adults. It's a way of kind of learning maybe how to communicate with teenagers, or how to be the best kind of adult or ally in a teenager's life.
Well, and you really actually create that with some of the adult characters in the book, right? Like, there are different adults who relate to the kids in different ways, and who advocate for the kids in different ways, or who are simply fulfilling certain responsibilities that require them to play a certain role in their lives. And so I love that aspect of it too, because as adults, I tried to think of as well, okay, who are the different adults in different places? And I think also will help young people see that there are adults on campuses that can really be helpful and supportive when it comes to this kind of thing. And that was sort of what you're touching on, which is, I think, important, that when it comes to quality sex education in this country, it's pretty abysmal. And that there are many people doing amazing things, absolutely. But when I travel and teach in different places and talk to parents in different spots, a lot of parents want to talk to their kids or understand, well, I don't know if want is quite the word, but understand the need to have these conversations, to be a responsible parent, because they want their kids to have happy, healthy, enriching relationships in their lives. But we never got that education either. So, it's really challenging, which was part of the reason why I wrote my book, because I would go everywhere and people would come up to me afterwards and say, well, what are your suggestions? And then they say, wait a minute, and hold their phone up to my face and try and record it, because we had no models for this either. We're pioneers. So I love that you've provided a vehicle by which we can actually have these conversations, not necessarily easier, but they become more accessible. And so I think that's a really valuable aspect of the book. Do you have any writers who have inspired you at all when it comes to being an author in particular?
Yeah, I have kind of an interesting influence that I think might be seen in the book. So I tend to lean very heavily into like mystery, like true adult kind of I don't even know how to describe it, kind of like gritty. Like I like complicated characters and I like that feeling of reading something and you're like, oh, I don't know if that was morally correct. Like I don't know how I feel about that. And that kind of idea. So I really love like Gillian Flynn, for example, has been a huge influence on kind of my understanding of how to write women specifically. So how to talk about how women are written about, what we can basically do with our female characters and that kind of idea. I love Riley Sager's work. I love being able to kind of explore, again, how to write women and how to write strong women and what that actually means and, what you can do with storytelling. I think it's so interesting. It's definitely, in terms of genre, a little bit of like a reach, but it's something where I'm hoping to kind of tap into that as I'm growing and learning what I want to write and things like that. I really do hope to kind of explore mystery a little bit more and maybe adult fiction or something just a little bit like darker maybe in the future. I have no idea, but that's definitely something that's really important to me is characters and being able to talk about characters and making them feel very authentic and complicated in a real way.
And so will we see any of these characters that you've conjured up for us in this book, Revenge of the Sluts, again at some point? Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I have. I've considered it. We'll have to see what happens. It's definitely been something where I'm just kind of working through some stuff right now. I love the characters. Honestly, I find them really hard to let go of, if that makes sense. Like I wrote it and I was like, yeah, this is totally a standalone. And then I was like, I don't know, like the more I've been doing like book promo and the more I've thought about it, like the more I've like missed them. I miss writing about them. I miss kind of being in St. Joe's. So we'll see what happens. I have no like hard plans yet, but I don't know. I love the characters a lot. I love the structure of the story a lot. So.
Well, and there's still so much more to learn because I think about, so how does something like this, an experience like this actually follow you in your life, right? Like going on to, as you journey through, or I mean, the majority of them are seniors, right? But there were also some other characters who were younger. And then how does this play out? What have you learned? What have the characters learned from this experience, or how will this evolve as they move on to college or working or whatever it is? Because that's such an essential aspect to understand about the internet, is that once things are out there, there's not a whole lot you can do. And when you lose control of your narrative, how do you actually then deal? And I think that that's something that, and two, I see where kids will experience that, but don't feel they can talk to their parents about it, and are alone in it and don't know how to move forward from it. And it can be really really sort of challenging. So I'd love to hear and learn more about through their experiences, for sure. And for any young people who might, if a parent were to try to introduce this book to their child and to say, hey, I went to this, event, I heard about this book, I'm really hoping we could read it. How do you think parents should present it to their kids in a way that would feel enticing, that they would actually be interested? Probably reading that first paragraph, right? I think it's such a catchy one. Do you have any advice or suggestions for parents?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. I think the biggest part of the story is that it is still a mystery. Like, it's still a YA contemporary. Like, I think when we talk about it in these terms, it feels very like big, and it feels really intimidating, and it feels a little bit like you're about to sit down and read like an academic paper. But it's really, I tried to do everything I could to make that not the case. I mean, there's elements of journalism, which personally I find journalism and kind of the elements of high school censorship exciting. Like, I find that really just interesting to talk about, and that's a huge piece of the story too, is kind of this mystery at the center of it all, the articles, the idea of kind of just like navigating high school. So it's still meant to be very much for young readers, and it's meant to be a story that they can relate to, or that they can find just like generally interesting and like as a page turner, rather than just something where they're like, oh, I'm gonna sit down and have to like learn something. I don't want to do that. Like, so I think it's meant to be like fun, I guess.
Yeah, I was thinking about how I might get my own children. I have 3 kids, and I was thinking about how I might get my own kids to read it and then to talk to me about it, and just to say, I'm wondering if I've been talking about this book, and I picked up this book, and I thought it was great, but do you think that it's actually true? Like, do you think this is a truthful representation of what teenagers, they love being experts in their own experience, which is such an important thing for us as parents to encourage them to be able to do, is to sort of ask them what their professional opinion would be, because they're the ones who are living it. So they'd be able to comment on it.
Oh,
Yeah, that was something I was thinking might actually work and be helpful for sure.
yeah, no, I love hearing what like it sounds weird to say because I'm like 23, but like what young people have to say about the book and how it feels to be in high school and just kind of growing up with technology, because it's just going to keep expanding. I mean, for me, I was there for the very start of things like Instagram and Snapchat, and I was in the like prime market for those. But now it's, what does it feel like being, 14 today, where you're being introduced to Instagram and Snapchat and, Twitter at like a totally different stage in life than I was. And I think it's going to be really interesting kind of hearing what their thoughts are and how they respond to it, and if things have changed at all, or if the last couple of years have been pretty much the same since I graduated, that kind of idea. I think it would be really, really interesting.
Well, yeah, and I find, just because I teach and talk to kids all day long about this sort of stuff, like, if you talk to them in that way, that's how they will respond to you, that they actually have so much that they're thinking about observing all the time and are so thoughtful about so many things, that, they may not initiate revealing or talking about, but if we're to approach them in a way that was non-judgmental, without shame, without judgment, that then they would come forward, and they do come forward in such generous ways about like their thoughts and feelings about what they're dealing with, what they see, what they hear, and what they think about it, for sure.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting is, so I had a review crew for my book, and which was like a group of kids who read everything before it went to the publisher, just to make sure it was all real and relevant, because the majority of it is all stories. I just think teaching about healthy relationships and sexuality through stories is actually the most effective way to go. And they were all stories I had heard for so long, over my 25 years of teaching. And I was trying to select the ones that had tried true with the issues that have tried true, but then the other ones that were more contemporary and really relevant to what's going on today. And a young woman said to me, she said, all the adults refer to teen culture. And she's like, but it's really not teen culture, because teenagers are just trying to, try to figure out how to get to adulthood. So we're just really holding mirrors up to you all and doing what we see the adults doing. And I thought that's really interesting because she's like, it's not teen culture, it's your culture. And we're just, trying it on in these different ways. And that's what you're seeing. So it's important for adults to think of it that way too. And that was super eye-opening for me. And I feel like your book in so many ways does that. Is it allows us as adults to see how teenagers see us and what's going on, and also then what they need and how we can talk about these things with them in meaningful ways. I love that aspect of it. And I was thinking too, sort of how I could suggest to parents, who I work with, when it comes to this book, like what are some of the ways you can start that conversation? And it's really just talking about the characters, kind of like we have, right? About who they are, what they do, what we find interesting, what resonated, and just saying things like, do you think they got to keep their dignity? Or do you think that that was fair of someone? Or what do you think about how everyone's, how so-and-so is judging so-and-so? Like, is that something that happens a lot? Do you think they made the right decision? Was there something, what would it have taken to do it differently? Those sorts of questions are really sort of the way to get at the dynamics I feel like you've written so beautifully that reveal the authenticity of what teenagers are dealing with in school a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that reminds me actually of a point you brought up in previous chats about like not asking why questions, which I think is such an important thing, is using the book as a way of kind of exploring it without asking like, well, why would you do that? Or why would you be interested in that? Or, why would somebody act in that way? It's a way of kind of opening up those conversations without immediately defaulting to a why or kind of a judgmental approach. And I think there's something really powerful about that, because I do think just naturally we kind of default to like, well, why would you do that? Like, that kind of idea. And I think that's very human of us, but it is something you can unlearn and you can work toward, asking more, okay, well, what can we learn from this? What else is here? That kind of idea.
Yeah, for sure. The second you ask, if you lead with why, you've already made a judgment, right? But the how, the what would it take? How do you think they felt? How could it have been done differently? What did you think about that teacher? And really allowing kids to be experts of their own experience, because that's ultimately what we're hoping to do and build credibility for us so that we can insert our own values there too. What would it take for both of them to walk away with their dignity, kind of thing. In addition to just the information that it yields, for sure, there's so much of it. I love that you've provided young people with language too around this topic, because what I know from all the research and empirical evidence that's out there in the social science is that when we provide young people with language, the probability of them getting into compromised situations or not healing from them because they aren't able to express what's happened to them is huge. And so, the very fact that it will provide kids with language and information about how to deal with this incredibly relevant topic is so important. So I really appreciate that too.
Yeah, I stand by kind of the power of naming something. That's definitely one of those things that really resonates with me growing up, because I think we really were missing that. I mean, there's obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than just being told simply what something is, or being told, okay, that was an act of revenge porn. But I think just having it named and having somebody recognize, okay, I get it now, like this is something, and it's not the first time this has ever happened. So there are resources, and there's, now you have a direction you can go when you're, for example, Googling something, or you're looking for resources in a book or something, you know where to look, because otherwise you're searching big terms online, or you might not even realize that what you're witnessing is something that happens, and that there are solutions to the problem. So that's what I wanted to hopefully do, is be able to provide terminology and at least like the very entry level starting point of a discussion.
Well, and the allyship too that's there, right? The examples of different relationships and different people who can actually help, who want to help with these sorts of situations. There was actually just a study that came out a couple months ago out of Boston University that tells us that when it comes to non-consensual sharing of photos, just like what your book talks about, and that people who are the victims of that actually experience it as if it happened in person. And, you know, worst case scenario, we're talking suicidal ideation, depression, anxiety, dropping out of school, like all kinds of eating disorders. Like there's all kinds of psychological and emotional impact that these sorts of things have. And, you know, and so knowing where to go, having language for what to say, to ask for help, I think is huge. And even within your book, the group of girls who experience this, their experience of the trauma in different ways, and how that's actually very accurate, because not all people respond in a similar way. And so how then as an adult might you know, I think it conjures up the question for people, like, how would you deal with this situation if it was your kid? And if it's your friend, or if it's someone you know, like, how do you approach this in a way that will feel supportive and is survivor centered versus something that, you know, compounds trauma and is exploitive? So it really does bring up all kinds of important topics of conversation, for sure.
Yeah, I think the representation of how different survivors might respond to a situation is so important, because that's something that I think it's kind of lost in the conversation. Is we just don't realize that people respond to trauma differently, and that people can come out of situations responding in completely different ways, or completely, like, it just might not necessarily make sense to you, but it totally makes sense in terms of how they're responding to the situation. And I think having that understanding, and I think having that natural sympathy and being able to say, okay, this is how they're responding, now we can work from there, rather than immediately kind of being like, well, again, you know, why would you do that, and that kind of idea. Having just an honest conversation and recognizing that how people respond is how they respond. It's, you know, you just have to work from there.
And we also know from research and evidence, the data tells us someone first responds to someone who discloses that something like this has happened has a direct impact on their healing process, and how they're able to heal from it.
Yeah.
So should we turn to some potential questions? Shane, do we know if there have been any questions in the chat?
So we have a little bit of a quiet audience so far, but audience, if you have any questions, be sure to ask those. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about, first off, your journey to being an author, because I think it is incredible. And also, Shafia, I would love to hear your journey as well, just to hear about what your experience was with kind of first books and how you kind of got to where you are now.
Yeah, so I started off writing from a pretty young age. I used to write in like physical notebooks, like I'd handwrite everything that I was working on. And then it reached a point when I was like, I guess I could just type these instead. So I started typing them, and then I wanted to just be able to kind of offer them to people. Like I wanted to be able to discuss my writing and talk about it and have kind of a writing community. But I was really kind of shy about sharing it with people who were actually in my life. Like I didn't want to give it to any immediate friends or family. My family knew that I was like a writer, but I don't think they realized how intense it was. Like it was kind of one of those, like, when I approached them and said, like, I have a book deal, they were like, oh, like you've actually been writing this whole time, okay. So I was definitely drawn to kind of the Wattpad model, which is where I kind of got my roots and started building a foundation as a writer, and just really worked on kind of what I wanted to write and what my voice sounded like. And just kind of having the chance to find like my people and have people around me who understand me. And, you know, the friends that I made when I was like 13 are people I still keep in contact with today, and we all talk about our books and things like that. So it definitely started off in kind of an interesting way, and then getting my book deal through Wattpad, and then just being like a, you know, first time author through them, it's been really, really exciting, especially because the publishing house is so new. So it's just, I don't know, it's just been a really kind of exciting, definitely an interesting journey, kind of a starting young and then working really hard to kind of get to where I am now.
I'm actually kind of old, so in retrospect, in terms of how that goes, you know, 25, 30 years ago, it started fresh out of school. really energetic and passionate about what I wanted to do, and was a social worker. And that work was pretty taxing. And so after several years of that, decided I wanted to get into more prevention work versus interventive work. And so became a health educator, because relationships in school were everything to me in my own development, and thought that that would be an inroad, a way to go, and pursued that. So taught health for many years and created programs. And then when I started to have my own family about 20 years ago, and have kids myself, just by default, I started to specialize in the classes, that worked with my schedule, and those were about human sexuality. And so through that specializing, then was asked to create a curriculum companion guide for the film The Hunting Ground, which is a documentary film about sexual assault on college campuses. And that garnered a bunch of media attention, which led to more media attention. And soon I was the consent lady, and sort of traveling to different states, different school programs, working with students, their teachers, and their parents on this very topic. And everywhere I went, the questions were the same. It was kind of amazing. I could be in Los Angeles, I live in San Francisco, I in the Bay Area, and teach all over here, and Utah, Colorado. I'd be in Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania. I mean, no matter where I went, the questions were the same. It was kind of amazing, from the kids as well as the adults. And so, I sort of shared a little story earlier in the conversation about how adults would try to record what I was saying, and really felt like they didn't have the tools and the strategies. They had the heart, and they felt like they really wanted to have these conversations because they knew it was important, but just didn't know where to start, and actually needed the words, and the language. What question do I ask? When do I ask it? Is it one big talk? Is it, and it's actually a collection of moments. It's lots of moments that you scaffold over time through developmental stages. And for the kids, it was the same thing. They just raised their hands. I'd be working with a room full of 100 kids, and they'd have the same questions that the kid 3 weeks prior in some other state and some other school had asked me. So a book seemed like a logical option, that then could sort of broaden and deepen my reach in terms of providing people with information as well as concrete strategies and language. So my book is actually written for both parents and kids. And the first half of every chapter is narrative, and it's all centered around all these stories that youth have shared, written, or told me, and I've transcribed. And then the second half is frequently asked questions, and I answer them like some kid has raised their hand in my class, to role model that language, but also to provide them with the short answer that really get, the quality versus the quantity, because that's how they digest information now. So that's how my book came to be. And it was exciting. I felt like to have those years of work that I had been working up to in something that I could hold and had written and could be really proud of, felt good. So I was really grateful to have the opportunity. And now when people ask me, oh, I missed your talk, or I did, where do I get this information? I actually have a book with lots of other resources. There's tons of other resources in the book too that I cite that people can educate themselves on, because there's actually a ton of really good information out there. We just have to connect it with people, the right stuff.
So when I came out, there was a lot of stigma around the word queer, and there's been a lot of people taking back that word and making it so that it isn't a slur, an insult, something that is yelled from the truck driving down the road, which has happened to me. But I'm wondering, there's so many words that are being, that is happening too, including the word slut. So I'm wondering if you specifically chose slut as part of your title to take back that word, give it power, and to help make that kind of revolution happen.
Yeah, I'm gonna turn on the light because the sun's right in the middle of this talk. So give me 1 second, that'll answer your question.
Yeah. Do you have kind of information about this?
I do. I mean, a lot of the work I do is social justice oriented, and there's a lot of language that people are reclaiming in the spirit of empowerment, right? And I think it's a complex issue depending on the language and the context in which it's being used. And I see that a lot when young people actually use that language with themselves and are trying to read context, and it's like okay in one context, but not in another. And and then I also have a more, I think, an old school kind of perspective on it too. And with specific language like queer, for instance, and I think it's so important as a part of our conversations around sexuality that we actually be really inclusive of lots of different sexualities and genders. It's of the utmost importance, especially if you're trying to encourage a sex positive orientation to someone, to your young person's sexuality. Queer I love because it really allows for fluidity and exploration, especially for young people, because it's such a bigger umbrella under which they can identify outside of binaries and really narrow representations of what sexuality should be. And I always say, don't let anybody shit on you or shit all over you. Like, that's not what will lead to living your truth. But I think that, when it comes to the word slut, I have not met a teenage girl who doesn't understand this impossible spectrum that they're trying to navigate between prude shaming and slut shaming. And that so much of the issues we see during sexual activity and sexual exploration and discovery revolve around how to navigate that impossible spectrum because both ends of it are negative. And so I'm going to let Natalie speak a little more to that in terms of her own intentions around the title of the book, right? It really grabs you, and using the word slut that way.
Yeah, I mean, the title was kind of a multi-dimensional decision. It was one where originally I just wanted it because it was kind of campy and kind of stupid and fun. It's just something where for me, even though the word slut carries this huge connotation, I mean, there's a lot of social weight that goes along with it. I mean, I was a teenage girl when I was writing the book. I absolutely understood what it meant to be called a slut, but it was also something where, I mean, since maybe being 11 or 12, people would call each other sluts as a term of endearment. It was like you were talking about, kind of a generational thing where for us, we were a little bit scared of the word slut, and we were worried about being perceived as one. We were worried about being perceived as, a prude. There's all these different things we were trying to navigate. And I think for a lot of people, the response was, well, why is that a bad thing? Why is it so bad to be called this? If you're going to call me that, I might as well just call myself that, and that kind of idea. So I think the word took on almost a kind of playful meaning, or something where people are like, well, it doesn't hurt as much if I call myself that to begin with. It kind of takes away the power of the word. And I also think a huge part of it was just wanting something a little bit kind of clickbaity. It's definitely because most people don't necessarily want to pick up a YA book about revenge porn. It just doesn't sound super fun. It's not something where people really want to emotionally commit to anything like that. It definitely has kind of an educational undertone to it. So it's it doesn't sound super appealing. So I wanted to have huge shelf appeal and something where people are oh, what is this? What is going on with this book? But yeah, no, I to your point earlier about reclaiming the word queer too, I'm part of the community. So for me, that's a huge thing, is trying to understand what reclaiming means. And again, with generational differences for us, it's most of my friends kind of identify as queer. It's a very kind of loose word where, we kind of just are figuring out what it means. And I think that's going to be something really interesting, kind of seeing, 10, 15 years down the road, what happens with identification in words and what that even means when you're calling yourself something, and what's going to hold weight, or what we're going to find offensive in, 10 years that's not offensive today, that kind of idea. So I think words are just really interesting. It's my sociology background, where it's the idea of labeling and things like that, or just I kind of geek out over it a little bit, because it's a really, humans are so interesting, and the way that we talk to each other is really interesting. So.
Well, and our language around sex really reveals how much we value and devalue certain aspects of it, and people who engage in, different people who identify in different ways and explore sexuality in certain ways. And so I really think that paying attention to language, and that in of itself is a valuable conversation that you could have with your kid, is like, so what do you think of the title, and what do you think about that, and about language and reclaiming language, and who has permission to use language that has historically marginalized people and been derogatory, like, what is that, and what are our values around it as a family, and what do we think about language, and the language we use to shape our relationships and reflect who we are in those different ways. I think there's all kinds of inroads to having this conversation. I feel like something that happens with parents is that when you talk about, when you say talk about sex, people immediately think you have to get really explicit in talking about genitalia and like reproductive systems and things like that. And it's actually not true. That there's a lot of information young people need, and there are tons of medically accurate, from credible resources, sex positive, places kids can go that you can show them to on the internet and books, that those resources that are great. But the one thing your family can provide that can't is like, okay, so how do you think about this, and how do you actually then treat people in a way that matters based on that information? And so these conversations are really about that. Like, so how we treat each other matters. What do we think about this treatment? What's the language we use to describe it and to talk about it? Engaging in encouraging reflection and self-awareness building, so that kids can think about that for themselves and who they want to be and how they want to show up, and how they educate others on how to treat them, and listen for how others want to be treated. That's really healthy relationship and sexuality education, that the majority of parents can provide that no one else can. Give them a book for the other stuff, point them to some really great websites, for the other stuff. But when it comes to that piece, that's where authentic connection, and as parents, we all know the most powerful way to teach something is to do it ourselves. So like, it's those conversations through authentic connection that aren't judgmental, that really, are genuine and caring and from the heart, that are going to actually mean the most and determine in many ways the quality of your kids' relationship later in
life. Can either of you, I was trying to think of a word for a like cis heterosexual man that kind of has historically carried the same weight as slut. And the closest I think I can come up with is like stud, which has none of the negative connotation.
Yeah, because even the idea of being called like this is super outdated, but like a womanizer is like, even that still carries a lot of, I think, like social clout. It's definitely like, I don't think there's anything necessarily that you could, yeah, no, that's a really interesting question.
The gendered socialization that we experience, like that goes back years and decades. Like I don't know of a single word that doesn't, that carries the same weight. And what young people use now is they'll say things like man whore or man slut, right? Like, which is really interesting in terms of using a derogatory term that's very gendered in a feminine, like female way, and applying that to men instead of creating one for identified men in particular, and toxic masculinity is sort of, I think, as close as we get to coming up with some sort of language that describes it. And now, in the research, it's called hypermasculinity. But that's what people were talking about. But in terms of the slang and the vernacular and sort of the language that's out there that would connote that same, carry that same weight, have that same sting, and have the same sort of impact. I don't know. I haven't heard of it or come across it.
Can you explain? I didn't realize that it had gone away from toxic masculinity. Can you explain what hypermasculinity is in relationship to?
Yeah, it's interesting because in talking about sort of the social constructions of gender, there was some backlash in masculinity is a very broad word that includes a lot of characteristics and aspects of what it means to be male in our culture. And really wanting to, just like being proactive around being sex positive versus sex negative, right? Like wanting to allow for people to aspire to something more healthy, that we can redefine masculinity as something that doesn't always have to be toxic, that can actually be, and to acknowledge and honor that there are many people who identify as masculine who don't exhibit, put into practice toxic practices, like toxic behavior. And so how then, when we say hypermasculinity, is where people have taken some of those norms and exaggerated, compounded, like put them basically on steroids to become toxic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because there was this backlash. It wasn't productive, because then people would take offense and get really defensive and be like, wait, I'm a man and I don't do this, right? Like, and I don't role model this. And in fact, I do the opposite. So how come I feel like by identifying as masculine, suddenly I'm also toxic? So trying to sort of create the space for people to redefine masculinity as something being positive and honoring those folks who are already doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think that as a non-heterosexual person, like masculinity has always been one of those topics that like I just kind of was like, yep, like this is not something I want to discuss. It's not something I want to think about because I don't identify like with the rigid kind of ideal of what masculinity is, and I never have. And so I think that that's a kind of good way to kind of frame it. And there is still, like, I will, even still not being a very masculine person, like identify that I have toxic masculine traits. So I don't know. I don't know if I would ever say that I have hyper masculine traits. Like I don't know, but I like to think about my masculinity and think about like ways that even just being like born male and having those traits like has kind of shaped like inherently who I am. So it's something that I've talked about in previous events and think about kind of increasingly more.
Yeah, no, I kind of going off of it too, because I spent a fair amount of time talking about gender and sexuality and masculinity as a whole. Kind of, I want to say that conversation around toxic masculinity specifically came in like, I feel like it started to really become a word I used in almost all of my classes, starting maybe like 2017, something like that. It felt like all of a sudden it was like everywhere, and that was like the big term. And I think there's been since then kind of figuring out how exactly to talk about it. And I mean, I think the biggest thing is like just having a discussion about masculinity. I think that's kind of the key thing, is like just the fact we're even talking about it in the first place and figuring out kind of where to go from there. And the reason why this point's coming up is because Shane was kind of talking about, you know, what that means to be like, you know, hyper masculine versus like, you know, toxic masculinity and those individual traits. And I think if there's, you know, anybody who's listening who's kind of like a little confused or a little bit lost with like what all this stuff means, I mean, the most important like takeaway is that we're even talking about masculinity in the first place, considering we've kind of just let it be as it is for so long, kind of unpacking it, to use my, you know, social science terminology, and understanding what that all means, what it means to be masculine, what it means to be a man growing up, how we can raise men in different ways, and what kind of influence that'll have on society.
Well, and to question all those things too. You know, there's so many programs now around women's studies, right? Who's his story, right? Like whose history has actually been, and sort of the ways by which we try to be more equitable, but also, in terms of the social sciences, also in unpacking masculinity, I think the gender paradigm, like, it's imperative to talk about masculinity because it's the gender paradigm that actually keeps these cultural norms that get in the way of authentic connection and healthy relationships for all people. That they are so inherently intertwined. And I do activities in my classes, and kids know it. I mean, they're so aware of it. They are so gender socialized from such a young age that when you do these activities of sort of, brainstorming the cultural norms, putting them side by side in that juxtaposition, also more gender expansive sort of assumptions, cultural assumptions, when you look at all those lists, it's kind of amazing what you notice and determine and understand about how they reinforce each other. These sort of binary masculine, feminine norms, and how influential they can be, especially when it comes to sexuality. People talk about progress and change. Peggy Orenstein's books talk about this beautifully, and how we talk about all the change that there is in the workplace and other places. I mean, we still got a long way to go, but how there's been some progress made. But boy, when it comes to sexual relationships, romantic and our sexual relationships, the same issues that existed decades ago are still very prevalent today. And a lot of people who have said, how come we're not talking more about masculinity and unpacking it? Because when you look at sort of violence in this country, when you look at statistically perpetrating sexual assault, like there's a lot to be looked at, but we tend to not focus on that because we're trying to move away from it. But what about unpacking it to dismantle it and reimagine it in a way that could be healthy and support all the efforts that we're making to move forward in more equitable and inclusive ways, for sure.
That just reminded me, I just finished reading Peggy Orenstein's new book, Boys and Sex, and it was wonderful. It was so interesting and just so approachable. It just really explores, it was just, I don't know, like, it was one of those books where I read it and I was like, yes, this is so interesting and so good. And it's such a open and honest exploration of sexuality, and was just genuinely so helpful, I think, for me. I learned things from it. I know it definitely made me ask a couple of questions and kind of want to explore a little bit. I mean, it's just, I definitely can't recommend it enough.
I realize that we've gotten a little bit away from the topic of your book, Natalie, but I will say that we do have an event coming up on March 19th with Catherine Angel for her new book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, Women and Desire in the Age of Consent.
I have that on the TBR list.
There you go. So yeah, because I feel like our conversation kind of focused a lot on that, I think that people watching this might be very interested in that event as well.
I'd be interested in that.
Yeah.
The audience for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Angel is going to be in conversation with founder and director of the Feminist Research on Gender and Sexuality group at Arizona State University, Brianna Foz. So I think that's going to be a really great companion event to this one. Yeah. And I'm really excited, Natalie, that we got your book straight from the printer. So we have more copies that will be received and ready to go out the door tomorrow. So everyone watching, go order the book right now. And I'm so thankful, Shafia, that you had this conversation today. I learned a lot. So I did not anticipate learning so much about sex and sexuality and all that. I was like, oh wait, great, we're going to talk about YA fun slut book, which we did, and we should celebrate that. And but I learned a lot today. I thank you both for that.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
And to the audience watching, we will see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.